a decent lunch break and you're kind of full of beans ready to go this afternoon. The session will run for about 90 minutes, so we'll be done by 3:30. If you need to get away a little before then, that's fine. And what I'll be doing today, as Jennifer pointed out, is highlighting some of the features of OneDrive and SharePoint and how you can use those to work well with your team and collaborate easily and efficiently. So I'll just go ahead and I'll be using a slide deck today just to kind of highlight a few points. But please do chip in with questions or things you want clarified at any point, because I don't want you to go away thinking, oh, I wish I'd asked about something. The idea is we're all here to learn together, so don't be shy about chipping in with questions. So I'll just go ahead and share my screen and I'll get us going. Okay, so today we're going to be looking particularly at OneDrive and SharePoint, because I think they're really powerful features of Microsoft 365 and the ways you can use them to collaborate effectively across your team. So here's a quick overview of how we're going to tackle it. So I'm going to do a quick check-in exercise to get us all up to speed, and you can tell me a little bit about your experience with Office 365, but then that'll be totally anonymous, so don't be worried. I'll then give an overview of how OneDrive and other products relate together. And then in a reasonably long middle section, I'll be talking about doing a demo of how I use OneDrive myself and how I think you can use it to best advantage. And then in the kind of second, or the third, I suppose I should say, we'll be looking at how you can use the two products, SharePoint and OneDrive, as a whole team, and things you might want to think about as you're doing that. Okay, and at each point, there's going to be time to kind of ask more questions, so don't be feeling like, oh, I can't ask, because I'd really like you to chip in if you can. All right. So we're going to start off, and I think some of you may have done this before if you've been to other Curve training sessions. I'm going to ask you to put yourself on the map. So the way you're going to do this is, I think down the bottom of your screen, you've got an annotate tool. Looks like a little pencil. And if you click on that, you'll be able to make marks here. So I'll get started. Somebody's on a journey there, I think. So you can just do a dot or whatever you feel like. And the idea is we'll just get a bit of a sense of where people are based. Wonderful, people are using stars there. That's a really good symbol to use. It's, those are people who've had a bit of practice. I will just wait a minute or two just to see how that pans out. I'm aware that there might be people from even further afield than where this map shows, so use an arrow to indicate that if you wish. Okay, so annotate should be in the toolbar. You have various different symbols, and annotate looks a bit like a pencil.
So for me, up at the top, I've got you are viewing John Fitzgerald's screen in green. Then there's view options to the right-hand side of that. If you click that drop down, and then there's annotate there. I think it's different on different devices.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, the problem is because I'm doing the share, I can't see exactly what you're seeing, but great. Now we've got somebody out in the West Atlantic there. That looks like a wonderful place to be. Can we zoom out further? We can't, I'm afraid, because I just had to plonk this image in, so it's a static image. In theory, I could have screen, but if I'd screen shared something I could zoom, people's marks would probably end up all over the shop. But okay, yeah, so we can't go further down than Leeds, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. I think you're going to have to use an arrow if you're further south than Leeds. But thank you for joining us.
Got quite a few people down south in this one.
Yeah, great. Okay, that's grand. Kent, that is pretty far down in the southeast. I hope it's nice and warm down there. Right, we're going to move to another quick dotting exercise now. I was partly doing that out of geographical interest, but also to get us ready for the next thing. So on this next slide, we are going to use a grid system here. So in the columns, top to bottom, we've got whether you're basic or advanced in your use of OneDrive and SharePoint. And in the rows, left to right, we've got whether you're in a big team or a small team. So if you're in a small team that's quite basic, you'll want to be bottom left. If you're in a big team that's quite basic, you'll want to be top left. And if you're advanced big team, you'll be top right. And advanced small team, you'll be bottom right. I think I remember that correctly, which is good, because I thought I was going to confuse everyone by saying wrong quadrants. Okay, so I'm trying to count how many dots and marks are on there. There's quite a few. So I think we're all relatively basic. I think there's a few more small organizations and big organizations. I didn't actually define small very precisely, but my guess would be if you're less than 5, then you're probably small. Does that sound about what people were guessing when I said it? Yeah? Okay, great. That just helps me think about what features to emphasize and where to pitch things today. If at any point you're thinking there's a point I haven't covered that would be really relevant to you, just highlight it in chat and we'll pick it up, because I want to keep the session flexible. Okay, great. Well, thank you for that. So, right, I need to clear those annotations because that's going to be distracting. Annotate, clear all. Okay, right, great. So, what is OneDrive is the obvious question to start with. I'm just going to run through that because I think it's really helpful to kind of get clear on that point before we go much further. So, as with many Microsoft things, there's actually a few options here. So, there's two main types of OneDrive. So there's OneDrive Personal. The icon for that's down the bottom left. And that's like a personal file store. So you'd often see OneDrive Personal if you're setting up a Windows 10 PC and it prompts you to link it to a personal Microsoft account. What that enables is folder backup from your local PC to the Microsoft cloud. So that's OneDrive Personal. OneDrive for Business is linked to your organization's Microsoft 365 account, and that's your basic personal storage area within your organization's cloud storage. SharePoint then is a structured storage system where all your team folders get shared. So these three do very similar kinds of things because you could make files available from all of them, but they do it in slightly different ways. So we'll just go through that in a bit more detail. So OneDrive for Business, I think this is, to my mind, the main thing we're going to be talking about today. So it's a personal store. You can share it because it's based in the cloud. It's always backed up. That's linked to your organization's 365 account. And the advantage with that is it means it'll get a higher level of backup than it would do if it was a personal one. And for things like GDPR, if somebody made a subject access request, you could do discovery from this. So your systems administrator could set it up so they could say, right, if somebody comes in and asks for every piece of data we've got, we can include OneDrive within that. So it's a really good place to store stuff you're working on for your organization. And it's definitely where I start every draft I do, always tends to start in OneDrive for Business. Now, confusingly, there's OneDrive Personal. And this, as I've said, is the personal folder syncing that you get out of the box of Windows 10. But for your organizational stuff, I would avoid it because it's not linked to your 365 account. It's not going to have the same level of backup, and it's not going to be as easy for you to transfer stuff to colleagues. So for today, we're saying no to OneDrive Personal. Although you'll see it there in your applications tray in your computer, I would avoid it when you're doing work stuff because of the backup reasons and also the point about data discovery as well. SharePoint then, this is like the team shared storage area, and it's a bit more structured. So you'll probably have seen things like building SharePoint pages or giving team members permissions to SharePoint folders. So it's a bit more structured, like a network storage drive would be. And that means it needs a bit more planning and organization. So you can't just throw people into a SharePoint set of folders and leave them to it. They'll often need a bit more steerage and prompts. So are there any things anyone would like to ask about in terms of that initial setup? Any questions at all?
What about if you haven't got business OneDrive, but you've got the family or personal 365 account?
That's a really good question. So is that on kind of budget grounds that you're just using the personal one?
I'm a church worker, so church people aren't very IT technical around some of this stuff. I
Yeah.
like 365, so I'm getting it for myself, but using it for work.
Okay, that is a good question. So one point that's probably worth emphasizing is the very basic tier of Office 365. It's called Microsoft E1. That's available free to charities. So that means a whole team could use it all on the web for free. They'd need to pay a little bit extra if they wanted to use applications. So I'd really encourage you to think about getting your other team members to take that up so that you're all using it. If you're using it personally, I guess, I think I'd be thinking about what's going into which folder and thinking about, in particular, on the GDPR angle. If you're using a laptop for personal work and church-related work, what a good scenario to think about is A, what would happen if that went missing or was broken? Would you still have a recoverable backup? And then the other question would be, if somebody said, we need to see every document or file that's related to me because I'm a GDPR subject and I'm making a subject access request, would that be a real hassle to do? So I think if you're very disciplined in the way that you're filing things, then it would probably be okay. I think the other question I'd ask, if your other team members aren't necessarily using it very much, is you're actually losing out on a lot of the value there, because to my mind, a lot of the value you get from Office 365 is when the whole team are using it together, because then things can be shared very easily.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
It does. It's practicality. Sometimes you can see the benefits, but others can't necessarily, and you have to work with
Yeah,
what you've got, don't you? But
of
yeah.
course. Yeah, yeah. Grand. Any other questions on those points about the way the different products relate to each other? Okay. Is that all clear enough then, or was some of it confusing? Pretty clear? Great. Okay. So I'm now going to just give a quick run through of how I work. And the reason I'm calling it how I work is there's not necessarily a kind of orthodox way that you have to use Office 365. You can use it in a few different ways, but I think the way that I use it is, well, it's very natural to me, of course, but I think it gives you a lot of the benefits, mostly to do with making sure that everything you work on is shared in the cloud from the get-go. So to do that, I'm going to just do a screen share. So I'm going to do a new share. Which one do I want? I need to find it. Give you 1 second. Yeah, here we go. Right, so what I do is, I hope you can all see that new share. I'll just give you a second because sometimes it takes a minute to come up. Is whenever I'm starting with anything that I might want to share with colleagues, so like say the earliest draft of a report or even a little to-do list or something like that, I always just go to office.com in my web browser. and sign in with my Office 365 account. And from here, you get this really useful set of shortcuts. You can actually customize which shortcuts appear at the top. And for example, I could start a new Word document. And I'll explain why I start it this way in a second. You might be asking, why don't I go to the Word app and start from there? And the reason why is that if I start from here, right from the minute I start typing, it's been saved in my personal OneDrive storage area. So you can see there, that's in the OneDrive storage, and I can just start working. And I find that's really advantageous because it means that I don't have to do any transferring or uploading or anything like that. It's just all ready to go out from the minute I've started. Now, I think some of you joined this OneDrive training document, and I think you can see if you look here, you can see a few people, and so I can see once I've shared a link with somebody, I'll be able to see where they are in the document, what they're up to. Now, one question I think somebody asked was, if you're using cloud-based storage, what happens with autosave? Because what do you do if you want to roll it back to an earlier version? And that's actually really easy. If you just go to the arrow in the top right here, beside where it says saved, you've got a menu item called version history. And if you click this, you can see all the versions you've saved. Now, it's not going to save literally every piece of typing you do, but if you type for a bit and then wait for a second until it completes an autosave, it will save that as a separate version. So you can see this very first one was the blank page I started with. Then I typed a line and added another one. So you can see that's all available to me to back through. So you could either from that, you could restore back to the first version you wanted, or save a copy if you wanted to take a clean version. So that for me is a very powerful feature. So the next thing I'm just going to show, and this is probably familiar to a lot of you, but is the share menu. I'll just do that slightly with a slightly wider window so you can see it's labeled share. It's up near the top right, and it's got the big arrow coming out of the box. And there's a few options here. So the first one that you would see is anyone with a link. And that means you get a link that's like a really long web address. And that means that literally anyone could access that. That could be a good thing to do if you're publishing something to the web. But for most organizations, most of the time, that's not enabled. And the reason why is that it would mean that any document you shared, people wouldn't even have to sign in to see it. It would just be accessible to anyone with a link. So it's a bit too shareable, if that makes sense. The next option down is the one that I use all the time, which is people in SCVO in the link. In your organization, it'd be your organization's name. And the advantage of using that link is you don't have to keep track of who you've sent the link to. You can just say, right, I'll take this link, I'll put it on my clipboard, and I'll copy it. So I can put this in the chat now. You won't be able to use it because you're not in my organization, but if you were, that would stay stable as well. So if we did things like change the file name or move where it was, that would still be accessible to you. So that's the reason why I use that method most of all. And I would encourage you as well within your teams to just do that all the time, because it means that people are never having to ask to be authorized as editors. The way that I shared it with you lot, of course, was specific people. So I typed in your email addresses. I know that some of you decided you didn't want to put your email in a Microsoft form on the web, and that's fine. But that's a way you get people external to your organization to share. And when you've done those things, you can look at the bottom and see whether they be editors or whether they're just going to be reviewers, and whether you want to prevent them from downloading. So that comes up if you're sending it externally. You might want people to look at something but not download it, perhaps because it's still a draft that you're working on together. Okay, so that's the sharing side of things. Is that all clear enough? I did that in some detail, but that's because I think that's where a lot of people tend to hit snags, is thinking about how that share menu works. Are there any quick questions at that point? Okay, the next thing I want to show you, and this is an interesting one because not many people have heard of it. Has anybody heard of Microsoft Delve before? You can nod or shake your head. Okay, right. Well, it's a really interesting feature, and I'll just access it from the Office homepage here. It looks like a big D. It's red at the moment, but I think Microsoft might rebrand it at some point. And what it is your personal document history. So if you click on me up in the left, you get a little kind of personal profile. And then when it loads, you see a chronological list of everything you've been working on. It's a bit like kind of web history in a browser or something like that. And I find it's a really, really useful tool. That's why I bookmarked it. I think you may have seen it's my top left bookmark in my web browser, because it just means whatever I was working on, and you can see there that the most recent thing is the test document I created and the training document as well. So Delve is a super useful place to go. You could bookmark it at dbr.delve.office.com. That's probably the link that would work for most people. And I find that gets around one of the big problems you often have with cloud-based working, which is remembering where things were when you started drafting them. So Delve is a good recommendation. Okay, so I'm just going to hop back to the PowerPoint. So I've highlighted this menu again because I think it's really useful to think through it. But as I say, people in your organization with the link is probably a really good default to go for, because it means it's just accessible to your team all the time. And that's just showing the flow of how things work. So I'll be starting with an app in office.com, whether it's Word or PowerPoint or Excel. I'll get the share link and then I can paste that into anything I choose. It could be Teams or Slack or Outlook. Delve, as I said, is this document history. Another nice feature you can do with Outlook is if you're starting an email message, if you hit the attachment button, you can look at stuff that's come up in your OneDrive and you can share it as a link rather than an attachment. And that can be quite a good way if you want to quickly get some feedback on something, but know you might change it later. You can say, well, here's the link, and then somebody can put suggestions into you that way. Okay, so now I've gone over that in reasonable detail. Are there any questions about that process, the way I was using it there? Feel free to just tip a question in chat if you wish to.
Can I just ask?
Please do, yes.
So I think we would tend to go into, we would go into Teams and do a new document.
Yeah.
So is it the same going into Teams new document as it is going into SharePoint new document? I think I still don't quite get, because it's almost like they are the same, but it's a different format.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Gemma, and we will touch on that in a wee bit, but let's talk about it now while you've raised it. So the way Teams works is obviously it's a collaborative discussion space, but what each Teams channel does is creates its own ad hoc piece of SharePoint storage as well. So whenever you look in a Teams discussion, in fact, I'll just screen share now. I've got Teams open, got a lot of windows open. Yeah, just looking at a Teams page now, and you can see post is the active page. I can click on files here. There may not be any files in this, but I think there probably will be. And where these files are in a kind of ad hoc space in SharePoint, so I can open them in SharePoint. So if you do start a discussion in Teams and related files, they will get saved up in SharePoint. That's fine. One issue that people run into though is there's not much structure to that. So I didn't keep it open for very long, but that was just, there was a folder called documents and then one with that team name. So it's very flat. And what we tend to find is sometimes if a team's discussion has been going for a long time, you'll then have this folder that's got a really big long list of documents in. And people can find it okay from the chat because you're just looking at a link as it comes up in discussion. But if you're going back later, then it can be a bit tricky. So the way to get around that, I'll just go back to Teams, is you can add a SharePoint document library. So the way I did that was I'm in the Nevermore, I'm in whatever the team name is, the plus sign over here to add a tab. And then if you add a document library, what you can do there is these are all structured folders you've created in your SharePoint structure. So quite a useful tip if you've got a new team starting for the first time and you know that they're going to be going for a while, is give them a SharePoint document library, because you're going to be able to do a bit more in terms of managing folders and structures. Because if it's just using the ad hoc file directory from Teams, it can get a bit messy. Does that answer your question?
I think so.
Yeah.
So I guess you're saying really you want to be making a document not in Teams but in SharePoint, purely that it's going to be better organized and it's going to be easier for everyone to navigate.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll, in the next part, we'll discuss a bit more about, how your team operates and what the issues might be around shared folders and things like that. I think if you're just needing to do something quick and ad hoc, like a team agenda or a notes, then by all means, start it in Teams. That's perfectly fine. It's just that if it then goes on to become a reference document for the team later on, that could be a slightly messy strategy. But yeah, okay. Any other questions at this stage? Okay, cool. We'll hop back to the PowerPoint. So actually, Gemma asked her question right on cue, because we're now going to talk a bit about how we work together. So I think the first thing is you want to agree on some organizing principles. And obviously you want to share all the same kind of principles or ideas about how you're going to file stuff. But I think I'd avoid doing that in the abstract, having a kind of perfect system. It's probably just worth thinking about, well, how do we actually end up working in practice? So like one organization I used to work in, everything was very chronologically based. So a really obvious way to work there was have folders for each year, and then you'd look through each year to kind of find stuff for the relevant year. But another organization might have lots of multi-year projects, in which case you might need to do it by theme. So anyway, it's really about kind of thinking about how's your organization been working in practice, so that whenever you come up with your principles, they actually fit what you want to do, rather than being a kind of thing that everybody has to struggle with. So just to illustrate that, say you got a kind of pine branch. On the left, somebody's organized it by length and by color, but actually in nature it has a kind of branch structure. And you might say on the left, well, that is more organized because it follows some really formal principles, but actually in terms of usability, a branch and pine needles is probably more effective. So that's where taking a bit of time with your team and thinking, well, what's going to work best for everyone? That'll mean you can get the best way of doing it together. So you might be in a position where you've got a top-down kind of strategy, where this might work if you've got a lot of files already, structured information. So maybe you've had a really full network storage drive that you've been using together, and there's a really clear process for that. And I think this can work well in bigger organizations because there is that kind of structure and organization. And also, I think with SharePoint pages in particular, you tend to need a bit of capacity of people to be spring cleaning them now and then. So making sure the key documents are in there and pinned to the top and all that kind of thing. And another different approach, which might work better in small teams that work in a very agile fashion, is to do it in a bottom-up way. So that might be a little bit like what Gemma was talking about with just having a Teams discussion and starting a new file there. So that fits in really quickly with the way you're working. But the downside can be if you're working for a long time, you can end up with a very big directory of files. And obviously with search, you can always find things again if you need to. But if you have new team members starting, that can be a big step for them if there's just this massive list of files and they're not sure where to start. So this is just another picture to kind of illustrate. You might have a team that say, right, let's just get the sledgehammer out and start going. So they're very empowered, but maybe not very organized. Or we might have another team that kind of sits down and plans it all very carefully. So I'd like to do a bit more interactivity now, and I'd like you to reflect on whether your team is a structured team, like the one on the left, or a free-form one like the one on the right. So if you want to just use the annotate tool, so that's under view options, as Jennifer said, and just make a wee mark that corresponds to where your team are at. Okay, that's great. I think we're seeing a bit of a trend of more structured, organized people, which is great. Does anyone want to chip in a bit on that point about why they put themselves on that side, or how that works for them as a team? I noticed that I couldn't help noticing that one person who was on the freeform side had a question mark, and I wasn't sure whether that meant that was just a symbol they felt like, or if they weren't sure. Julie, were you wanting to chip in? No, okay, cool. That's all right. I could just see, I could see lips moving, but I wasn't sure. I'm aware that we may also be juggling other calls or situations at the same time. Okay. Oh, somebody's going to chat. Some structure. Okay. Yeah. And Angela said, just setting up SharePoint and looking at how to structure it. Angela, just related to that point, do you have any other models or resources for shared documents already, or is this the first time you'd be sharing online documents as a team?
We've started using Teams only since the start of the pandemic, so we only got our updated Windows this year. We've been working on 07, so I think we're just trying to see what the capabilities are and learning every day. New things, really. So.
Yeah. And what about with, pre-pandemic in your office, would you have used things like big whiteboards on the wall, or would it have been calendars, or what ways would you have shared information across the team?
Paper and emails, mainly.
Yeah, and were the bits, that's perfectly reasonable, were the bits of paper kind of filed, or how did that work?
No, so we we've really struggled, I think, in the past to actually work collaboratively, because it has been send an email with an attached document, send it back. Our drives are a mess because people have struggled to know where to save things. So we've been basically going through things, chucking stuff out that we don't need, and looking to build the SharePoint platform and use that for our filing. So at the moment we're still sitting with the old system, but we've started to use the Teams and shared files for specific projects, and hopefully that'll expand.
Yeah, that's really commonplace. And I mean, I think what the approach you're describing there of just starting with the new projects and kind of making a fresh start with them, that's really quite effective, because it means that as time goes on, gradually everything that's still active is in the new system. And obviously in the early days, you'll have a time where there's a bit of both going on, but that can be a very effective way to do it. I used to, going back early in my career, I used to run a publishing team. And one way that we ended up using storage, it was long enough ago that we used to worry about running out of storage quite a bit. So that was a kind of pressure to make sure that we freed up space and then drive. And because in this publishing team, everything was related to a particular magazine or book or whatever, before digital, we had a kind of job bag that used to follow it around the office. So that's the way our folders ended up being structured, was there was a folder for every project. And then as they got completed, they went off to an archive, so we could still get them off the archive, but they weren't live on the network anymore. So that's one approach. As I said earlier, another organization, it was based very much around project year. So that was an easy way to organize it. But it will depend on what ways your team work together. And some teams tend to share stuff right from the beginning. So maybe it's that very first draft. You want your team to see it and be involved, and even though it's very rough and ready. And other teams tend to want to share information only when it's reached quite a final stage. So there's kind of two different approaches there. Any other quick thoughts? So Paul, I think you said organizations are structured around digitally confident and incompetent, i.e. me. So I'm assuming you're the digitally confident, Paul, is that right? No. Do you want to say a bit more about it, or was it just an observation?
I think smaller organizations, we have two people that digitally know what they're doing, and everybody else to a greater or lesser extent doesn't. So I think that tends to be where small organizations are. You're structured around the capacities of individuals, and it tends to go in the direction that they want to go in. I think particularly recently we've seen that. So the structure of our organization hasn't changed, but the digital structure of our organization is different. Yeah,
that's right. And I think one kind of aspect of digital is that because you can create lots of files very quickly or move them, it's not like, if you're going back 15 or 20 years and you had a bank of filing cabinets, if somebody decided, I want to structure this differently, then that would have been an afternoon of heavy lifting. So there would be a kind of barrier to doing it. Whereas now people say, oh, I think I'll rename this folder, and then everybody else gets lost quite quickly. So you have to think about that aspect too. Just from chat as well, Sarah's pointed out that people within her organization have very different approaches in terms of planners versus get stuck in type people, and that's complementary. And I think that's the point to remember as well, is that you can maybe find organizing principles that align well with the way your team needs to work, but there'll always be people who it feels a bit uncomfortable for. Maybe if they're very fast moving, slightly disorganized people, they don't want to take the time to remember which folder to put something in. Or if they're very fastidious, organized people and they think, I'm annoyed by these files that aren't quite in the right place, there'll always be that bit of friction, but I think you just have to live with it. And I think the main thing is that having a bit of time now and then to check in is really helpful. I'm going to move on now a little bit. I'm going to clear the annotations. I always forget to do that. So one approach is to set up Teams channels and just see how they go. So I think that's close to what Gemma was talking about. So the advantage with Teams is you can set up channels quite easily. And what you sometimes find is you make a guess to start with about, what are the main discussion threads we're going to have. And what you may find is some of those discussions grow arms and legs and become very busy places, in which case you might need to split them off to sub-channels like we've done here. Or some of them might become a sort of tumbleweed place where nothing ever happens, in which case delete them, because if nothing is being discussed there, then you don't need to have that as a separate channel. But because you got the capability, as Gemma pointed out, to create files within team discussions, that can help you get a sense of what are your team actually in practice, what's their natural way of grouping this stuff together. And then once you've done that for a bit, you can say, right, well, it looks like our optimal way of organizing it is like this. So that's a thought. If you don't have a predetermined structure, is to use that test and learn approach. Let me just hang on a second. I just want to see, would you like me to quickly demonstrate that in Teams about how you would add files, or is that clear enough for everyone? Pretty clear? Yeah?
I think we're getting nods, but I'm not sure
Tentative nods.
if that's yes, it's clear, or yes, we'd like you to demo.
All right, I'll demo it. Why not? We've got lots of time, so let's do that. So I'm in a Teams thread here, so it would probably start by default on the posts view where people are sharing things, and then in files, it'll just take a second to load, and I've got a new button, and I could create a new folder actually, so I slightly contradicted myself there because I think I said to Gemma you couldn't do that, but what would tend to happen, I think, is quite often people would just create new Word documents. So just create it. You then immediately get a kind of mini editor right here. It'll just take a second to load. So I could start doing some edits here. You always get this option to open a desktop app. I think you can see this in the middle of the screen next to light bulb in my case. So I can just write a few thoughts in there, close it, and that's there. So you get all the kind of SharePoint options next to files as well. So these are things like copying. The checkout feature is quite useful. So sometimes in SharePoint, obviously you can have multiple people editing at the same time, but you might have scenarios where you say, I want people to leave it alone for a bit while I work on it myself. So if you hit checkout, that means you can still edit it, but your team members can't until you check it back in again, and it gets that little red dot. If I open in SharePoint, I'll just do that now. You get the full range of SharePoint actions. So I will, version history is one to look at again. So with this one, you can do it straight from the file structure. So I'm not sure why that's giving times in the morning. This might be on US time, I guess. Even though I've done very few edits, it's given me 3 versions already. And this can be really handy if somebody has deleted a file, so you can go back and roll it back to the version that you want, or if they've overwritten some changes. I'm just looking for a question in chat. Oh, sorry, Amy, you're just seeing the Teams window. I think I need to do a new share. Give me a second. Thanks for flagging that. Right. So this is now opened in SharePoint. I think the share didn't keep up because I was switching tabs. So opening version history shows there's 3 versions already, even though this document's just been opened. And you can roll back to any of these. So we could restore it back to this version. And that I think is quite a useful one because quite often with the collaborative Office tools, people worry like what happens if our colleagues just make changes that totally wipe out important stuff I'd done before. The version history is a really useful tool for doing that. While I'm in this SharePoint folder, I'll just show you a few other features. So a nice one is pinning, actually while I'm on that there, I will check it back in. When you check something back in, you can say what you did to it if you want to. I'll pin it to the top. And what a pin to top means is that if somebody opens this folder on SharePoint, they'll see this as a kind of highlight. So that's a useful one for if you had a template that you wanted the team to look at all the time, you could do that. Okay, so that's a bit in SharePoint. I'm going to remove pin so my colleagues don't get confused about that. And I'll delete that file as well. Okay, so that was a bit on that. I'm just going to go back now to the presentation. Where were we? Let's finish smashing up our Office. Okay, so another thing I'll quickly show you is the point about adding a SharePoint library. So this would be, say you had a Teams discussion that was relating to a project, but there were already files relating to that. Using a SharePoint library means that be able to share to that particular folder. So going back to this Teams discussion, I do that by using this plus button, add a tab, document library. And for the sake of argument, I'll do this one, digital team. I'll not post the channel because that would cause confusion. Documents, next, save. So what that will mean is there'll be a new tab and it'll have the name of the SharePoint library. It's called Document Library, but I think you can rename it. Yeah, you can. And the advantage with that over just relying on the Files tab that comes up by default is if you've already got a kind of archive of historical documents, you can bring that in so it's really accessible from the Teams channel that's working on the project. Is that all clear enough? Okay. So I'll go back to presentation. So the other thing that I was going to say is I think, my default, I guess, is I'm actually quite comfortable with chaos. So I think as long as there's a link and I can use search, I'm never too bothered about have we got a nice, good classification. And I think probably a lot of teams are like that now. Now we're in the kind of digital age, people go, well, there's always search, we can always find stuff. But a few scenarios to think about are if a new team member started, quite often with a new team member, one of the things they're going to want to do is methodically look through and understand how it all hangs together. So, if you're doing a physical face-to-face induction, you might say, right, well, in this filing cabinet, we have our unpaid invoices, and in that one, we have our funding contracts, or whatever it might be. But with a digital environment, that's harder to do. And also, I think if you were inducting somebody remotely, they wouldn't be there sitting alongside you, so they wouldn't be able to quickly turn and say, can you remind me where to find that again? So that I think is an argument for being a little bit more organized sometimes. Or the other scenario is if you had to hand over a piece of work. So if somebody else needed to run a project for you, or if a staff member became ill quite suddenly, if you've got a good level of organization, that can often help people pick up things more easily. I used to work somewhere where it was a Mac-based shared network drive, and it was very, very chaotic. And new starts at that organization spent quite a lot of time just endlessly going through all the folders trying to find where stuff was. So that was a bit difficult. So sometimes a bit of organization can be beneficial. Is there anything anyone wanted to ask about on these points about SharePoint and approaching it as a team?
I had a quick question, John. I'm not sure if it's for this
Yep.
section or if you're going to come on to it, but I'm just thinking about, is there the ability to take those files offline? So for example, if you were going to be traveling or something like that and didn't have access to an internet connection, is that still easy to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that could be a scenario where you'd be better off taking a local copy and uploading and downloading them. I don't think there's a, well, let's look and see now quickly. I don't think there's, like in Google Docs, obviously, which is the kind of comparator product, that does work quite well because you can add a Chrome extension that enables you to work offline. But I think with Office, you'd be looking at just opening it in the browser, in the app, the relevant app, and doing it there. You could always download, but I think that's the problem. That's always going to be the problem is if you've downloaded, you've got to then remember to upload and make sure a colleague hasn't done a conflicting version. So it's a bit challenging. I mean, I think I would say these days, one nice thing about Office 365 is it works really well on a mobile device. And actually, I'll just do a quick share for that to show it. If you just give me a second. So this is my phone now, I'm just sharing it. And let's take the training document because it's a reasonably simple one. So this is just on my phone. I can do a quick edit in Word. It's just closing something else and opening something else. Now this is quite small, obviously, but that's just from my phone. I can dictate if I want to. This wouldn't be necessarily a way to approach a document that was really complex and had loads and loads of formatting, but it would mean from either an iPhone or an Android device, you can just pick up the edits really quickly and work with them. And I think you're right, Jen, there will be points where connectivity is quite slow, but Office 365 in recent years has been really well designed to work quite well under mobile connection or lower speed bandwidth. So it may take a little longer, but you can usually get stuff done. So that would probably be my default, would be trying to pick it up from the browser or the SharePoint app if I can.
Yeah, definitely. I think the portability of it, like, that's brilliant.
Yeah. Johanna's asked a question about yeah, so columns and images. I think that's probably been like a difficult feature in Word for years and years. I think it is still difficult. And I think one thing I often try and do to sort of make life easier is if I'm at the kind of collaborating drafting stage, trying to keep the formatting as simple and clean as possible, so that then whenever you've got the edits and comments in, you can apply the formatting then, because particularly for a mobile device, like I kind of deliberately didn't open a really column-tastic document there because it wouldn't have played very nicely. So keeping it simpler if you can, and then rolling it into a template or format later can often be better. So Sarah's asked a question about when would you want a team and when would you want a channel. So a team is a kind of pre-structured, so we say, for example, just take the argument that 4 of us, I don't know, Jen, Amanda and Leslie are working on a project. We'll establish that team. We're kind of creating a formal collaboration relationship between those people. They'll get notified about it and they'll have roles and so on. A channel is more of a kind of discussion thread that's a bit more open to anyone, so people can leave it or join it or mute it or hide it or discover it if they want to. So that's the main distinction. As a kind of team is like a work group. And the other thing, if you set a team up, you'll then get sharing permissions for that group. So by default, organizations or documents created within that team will have access rights for people that are on that team, but not necessarily to everyone else in the organization. And then a channel is more like a kind of a thread that people can join and leave in a more ad hoc fashion. Okay. Any other questions at this stage? No. Maybe can I ask just a question to the room, which is, are there any kind of common snags or obstacles that you're seeing? I'm imagining that quite a few of you are kind of relatively early in your use of SharePoint and OneDrive. And are there kind of common scenarios you're seeing and thinking, this feels like a big headache? Are there ways we could improve this at all? No. Can I also ask then, I know that some of you had said about getting started with SharePoint, and I just wondered if there's a split between people building pages and folders in SharePoint versus just using OneDrive in a more ad hoc way.
Can I just say, I think yes. One of the problems we've got in our organisation, and I've got to say this whole thing confuses the life out of me, but I think because what we did, we've been using it for a while, but I think what we did was we set up on the OneDrive, everybody has their own personal file as well. So I think what we've got into the habit of, and I know that I do that, is that I just automatically save everything into my own personal file on the OneDrive rather than into a shared. And I think because we've been doing that for a while, I think it's a bit of a challenge now to sort of, I suppose, to filter through all of my documents that I've collected over the year to then say which ones actually should I be sharing rather than keeping them in a personal drive, which is what, and I think that's everybody's default on our system. We have another part of the OneDrive which our admin and finance people keep updated, and that tends to have, obviously everybody can access that, and a lot of the shared things that you would expect to see in their policies, pro formas, those kind of things. But I think that's the problem that we've got now, is everybody's got into the habit of saving everything into their own personal file that has been set up on the system. Yeah,
that's a really common problem, and we experience that in our team as well. Like, I'm definitely guilty of it sometimes where, you know, because somebody's been able to access it through a sharing link, I kind of forget the need to put it somewhere more easily to refer to later. I mean, to use a kind of paper analogy again, I once worked opposite a colleague, and ironically, as a web manager was his job, but his desk used to pile up with paper all the way through the year. And like once a year, the very first January day back, he'd spend the entire day clearing his desk back to kind of, you know, the bare surface. And it would stay clear for about 10 days and then it would start filling up again. So I guess his philosophy was, I do want to do a kind of spring clean back every now and then, but I'm not going to do it every month or anything like that. But that was a bit of an extreme example. So maybe a kind of digital way you could do that is maybe have a team half day once a quarter where you say, let's block time together where we're working on it. And I know that one thing I've seen one team do before where they were having a lot of issues with lost files, and the way that people were sharing a network drive is we got a data projector, we projected the filing system up onto the wall in the office, and we all sat around and did a kind of keep or move or delete collectively. Now, it was quite a long process because we were all having to kind of discuss and do it, but it helped us get to a kind of agreement on where stuff should be in future. But it is that problem of if you're not carving out time to do it, then it can be hard to remember to do it later.
Yeah, and I think that's another issue, because obviously our admin and finance team, and I think everybody has their own way of where they would file things automatically, and it doesn't necessarily follow that somebody else has that same thought pattern. So I think that's one of the issues, and you're right, I think that's probably what we need to do. But we also need to understand from the admin and finance team where we would logically expect to file some of the things that we would file with that we've got in our personal drives, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That's a really good point. So it's a bit about having a bit of time to work it through, but then also saying, what is the policy? Because it might be that there's some ad hoc working documents where you don't need a big policy about where that goes, but there will be some like contracts or job descriptions and things like that, where if they're not in a sensible place, then that can create a big headache. So I'm just looking at in chat, and so Susan had asked about SharePoint sharing to external organizations. So that's a really good question. So there's kind of two ways you can work with Office 365. So one is to invite external users in. So sometimes you can do that on a one email basis. So you might have a couple of people collaborating on a project, and as long as you got their email address, they can get ad hoc sharing access to a folder. Or the other is you can formally add somebody with an external email address to your Office 365 domain, and that gives them a more expansive set of access rights, but you have to manage that a bit more in a more involved way. In my experience, often just giving people a kind of ad hoc sharing invite is a bit easier, but it can be challenging if they're needing access to multiple folders. The next question is about Planner. So Mark was asking about Planner. Has everybody heard about Planner, or is it a bit of a new one? Okay, that's fine. I will share it. I'll be honest and say it's not an app I use a lot, but it is a nice one, and it's free if you've got Office 365, which is nice. So I'll just share my screen. So Planner is a kind of shared task board. It looks like we probably don't have many that are very up to date, and the way it works is it's got lists or columns, and then you can add tasks as cards, and you can move them along. So unhelpfully, that one has only got one column, which isn't going to be very helpful in terms of the demo. This one might have more. No, same one again, sorry. And one. So new, it doesn't have anything on. Oh, it does. Sorry, it was just loading. Yeah, so you can move them along. I'm just checking chat in case there's a issue with seeing it. Yeah, very like Trello, Emma. That's a really good analogy to use. Trello is probably a lot more popular, but Planner is Microsoft's version of it. The reason why it might be worth considering instead of Trello is it is linked in, so you can do things like link it into a Teams channel. So maybe you've moved a task to a completed column, so it's done, and you can that can then ping a notification back to the Teams channel to say that's been done. Or if you assign somebody to a task, they can get notified in Teams. So that can be quite an effective way of working. It's not quite as colorful and flexible as Trello, which I think some people find a bit off-putting. And obviously, a benefit of Trello is it's very shareable. So that's the reason why some people prefer Trello. But Planner is a very capable app, and it has a very similar feature set to Trello. Yes, Sarah, you can absolutely have a personal planner, so that's fine. It can be a very useful thing to do. So it's not really necessarily a store for documents, although you can do things like link documents to the back of cards and things like that. But it's a good digital equivalent of if you had a really big whiteboard on your office wall with kind of all your live projects on, and you were giving status updates to the team. A planner can be quite a good way of showing that big picture overview. Gwen's asked about server, and yes, Gwen, I think it would be a really good replacement for a server. I think the only kind of considerations you'd have with a server about why you might want to keep one would be to do with if you felt your team might not have internet access, then having a physical server would mean they could still keep working and access things. But of course, if they didn't have internet access, they probably couldn't email anyone. So that might be a bit of a barrier anyway. Or if some of your team were having to work from somewhere that had really slow outgoing and incoming internet, then the server might mean that stuff could be stored there. The storage allowance on Office 365 and similar products is very generous, so you don't really need to worry about using up your storage space too quickly. And I think because you've got that combination of a personal OneDrive and SharePoint folders, you can have things which are related to the organization but confidential to you. So like if you and a colleague were collaborating on a I don't know, some kind of report or something where you didn't want the whole team to see it right away, you could still do that and then make a public version later. Sarah said very glad they'd replaced their server with SharePoint. Chat files to channel files without downloading and resaving. Yes, I think probably the easiest way to do that, that's a Teams question, would be, I'll just do it now so it's easier than talking. Share my screen again. So I'm in a Teams view here. Is that what everybody's seeing? And I'm going to wait for it to load. And I'm going to hit open in SharePoint. I might need to reshare to show the SharePoint page. So what that did, you wouldn't have seen the transition because it would have switched tab, but that's just opened it in a SharePoint view. So you can do things here like move and so on if you wanted to do that. Move to. Okay. I'm aware that I've not given any break at all this time. That was a bit mean of me. I hope you're all surviving okay. I'll just hop back to the presentation and we can maybe pick up a few more open questions just towards the end. And I think we probably will wrap up a little bit before 3:30. So let me just return to the presentation so we can pick that up. Well, actually, we've got to the more resources stage, so we can carry on with open questions. But a few resources I wanted to highlight before we do that is we've got a set of digital guides at scvo.org.uk/support/digital/guides. Microsoft videos are quite good on YouTube. So they've got a YouTube channel there where you can browse videos. And we actually, Microsoft have physical stores which aren't open at the minute. So what they've done with a team that used to demonstrate products in store is they're now doing online training. So Microsoft UK have contacted us and said, if any charities want free bespoke training sessions, they can do that. So that would be somebody who's a product expert, and Microsoft do it in their training environment so they can demonstrate lots of features. And if that sounds of interest to you, you can send me an email and they can sign it up. So you would then have, they would all need to be on the same 365 environment, which is why we can't offer it through the Curve, because the Curve people are lots of different charities all together. But that's a really useful offer because they can tailor it for exactly the kind of problems you're looking to grapple with. So I'm just going to hop back to chat now and see what's coming up. Right. So Martha was asking, yeah, so that whenever you've got a Teams chat, I'll maybe just show you now. Let me just demo it. It's easier, I think. Let's see. That's a good one to demonstrate on. Let's see. I'm going to find a chat that's a kind of useful one to do. So I'm going to share my screen. So I'm here in a group chat in Teams, and if I want to add somebody, that's not what I'm clicking. Sorry, I can't quite see stuff because I go to the heads, which are over on the right-hand part of the pane. It's the view and add participants, and if I add somebody, I've immediately got the option of, it defaults to don't include chat history. You can include it from a certain number of days or for all time. So that's how that works. I have a feeling in Teams that the default is to include the history from before, because certainly when I've been added to new teams, I've tended to see things from before. So Paul's asked about if you just do everything online, you avoid the bumpy formatting, and yes would be the answer. So it will keep it kind of more cleanly formatted because it's just linking to a live document. And I think that's the other thing, is I'd really encourage, if you can get your team comfortable with sharing links, it's a much simpler way of getting access, because it stays up to date and they don't need to worry about whether they're looking at the latest version. Essie has asked a question about path names. Yeah. So that's a really good point. So if you're just merrily creating lots of subfolder names, these all add up to more than 260 characters. Then Windows Explorer hits a limit. You can manually configure it to make them longer if you wish, but that's one to watch for. I've seen that in other organizations before, because some people like to have subfolders, because it's very organized, but can make Windows Explorer struggle a bit. Any other questions at this point? Julie asked about security issues. Do you want to expand on that, Julie? Was that to do with whether they're well backed up or unauthorized access, or what was the question there?
Yeah, it was just because we just started working with SharePoint and OneDrive at the start of COVID, obviously.
Yeah.
And we're told that anyone can access the files. So what we've been doing is saving them on that, then mailing them to ourselves, downloading them onto our server, and then deleting them off of SharePoint. So it does seem like a roundabout way.
So how do you mean anyone? Do you mean anyone in your organization or anyone
No,
anywhere?
anyone, because it's a website that anyone, anywhere could actually break in and access them.
So it's not accessible. I mean, Microsoft could get hacked, but I mean, they do a lot, because they're storing like lots of government data and things like that. They're doing a lot of practices to make it as secure as they can. So for example, your data is backed up across multiple sites, it's encrypted, it's what's called sharded, which means if somebody broke into one of the Microsoft data centers and ran off with a server, they wouldn't get a complete set of data, they get part of it. So the bottom line is it's much more secure than anything you could build yourselves, unless you're actually working from Fort Knox, which I suspect you're probably not. The other thing is if you're emailing lots of files around, that's creating lots of copies of them. So that's probably making it less secure.
Right.
I think one point to keep in mind is on file retention and data retention. So there's an inbuilt, I think, 90-day kind of backup. So any deletes that you do will be recoverable for up to 90 days. But if something needed recovered beyond that, you may need to look into additional solutions. Some organizations choose to have some recovery alongside SharePoint just as an extra bit of reassurance, but it's not strictly necessary. It'll just depend a bit on what needs you have around, if you're a regulated charity that might need to produce documents for legal reasons or things like that, you may need to look into extra steps. I think a more likely scenario to think about is making sure your Office 365 doesn't get compromised, so somebody doesn't use a phishing attack to gain access. And a good protection against that would be using two-factor authentication. Is anybody using that at the minute? Not many. So a few are. So two-factor authentication means you don't just need a password, you need an additional form of identification. So an example to use is if you're going to your bank to get some money from an ATM, you don't just need your card, you need a PIN number as well. So if somebody picks up your card in the street, they can't just go and empty your bank account. So two-factor authentication, a really common way of getting that is through a text to a mobile. So it's quite common now with online banking where you try and log in and it says, right, enter the code we've just sent to your phone. And you can configure Office 365 to do that. And the advantage with that is that if a hacker used a kind of very convincing looking website or Microsoft form to make you hand over a password, they would need a second form of identification to try and get in. So two-factor is really, really useful. And it takes users a little bit of getting used to, but once it's up and running, it makes things much more secure. So yeah. But yeah, on your question, Julie, I think it's a security you could want it in OneDrive, and I think the other practice you're talking about emailing and downloading is kind of making it less secure, I would say. And any IT professional would say if you've got a Microsoft 365 system set up correctly, it's as secure as you'd need it to be.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
That's fine. So yes, so Leslie asked about if you've got a personal, so that personal OneDrive, you can, yeah. So it doesn't have a default setting to begin with. So I think you saw whenever I gave my example, I had to choose on the menu between, I'll just share the screen to show it, just so that it's obvious. Hang on. Sorry, I'm just zipping back through. This one here, this came up when I had a file that I started on my personal OneDrive. So the option I always go for is people in SCVO with a link, or you could share it with, if you had to share it with some external people, it could be specific people where you add the email address. So that's the advantage of the OneDrive, is it's your personal space to begin with, but then you can choose how you share it from there. Rosie, yes, you can, and I'll just demonstrate that. So Rosie asked about if you can create a shortcut in SharePoint. So I'll just do a share and do that. So you're seeing the SharePoint page. You can go to, I'll deselect that so you get the right menu. Under the new menu, the bottom option here is link. And this can be any web address. I'm just going to do office.com to kind of show it. But this could be a link somewhere to a document, and you could then pin that as well. So hang on, I need to move my window up a bit. So that become a shortcut that people can access. Obviously, in SharePoint as well, you've got the whole SharePoint sites functionality where you can create like mini web pages. And when SharePoint was first introduced, this was the kind of the feature set that Microsoft really led with. And what they were encouraging organizations to do was, rather than having an intranet, like an internal set of intranet pages, you do it all in SharePoint. But actually, I think in practice, most people I've seen using it are much more using it to find documents, and it's the folder structure within SharePoint that is the most popular. But yeah, I'm not sure about, in response to Rosie's question, whether you can customize the icons on it. You might be able to. Let's have a quick look.
That's not important. It's super useful to see what you just demonstrated. So thank you.
Yeah, that's all right. No problem. Any other quick questions? We've come to near the end of our time now.
I don't know if it's a quick one, John, or it'll spark a debate, but Microsoft Office 365 versus Google Drive.
So that's a really interesting question. For charities, Google G Suite, which is the kind of small business official version of the Google products, is totally free, and you just have to go through a quick eligibility process to get it up and running. It's a very web-based platform, so the advantages of that are it's quite easy for people to get to grips with. It works in a really wide range of devices, and if you're administrating it, like adding and removing users and things like that, that's nice and easy to do. On the other hand, some people find the formatting in very complex documents doesn't work so nicely, and if you've already got a lot of Microsoft-based files, it can be a bit of a headache to move them, although it's not impossible. With Office 365, there is a basic version that's free. That's called the E1 version, but people don't have desktop apps with that. They just access it through a web browser like Chrome or Edge. The next version up, I think it's called E3, works out at about £4 per user per month. It can take a little bit of setting up. It's maybe a wee bit more complex than G Suite, but I think for users that have been using Office products quite a lot, it'll feel like a very easy transition. And you do get, I think the calendar management for some people works a bit more smoothly than Google Calendar, although Google Calendar is very capable as well. I think for a smaller charity, either would be fine. It would just depend a bit on where your team were coming from in terms of their experience, what might be easier for them to adopt. They're quite on an even footing, I would say. Any other quick questions? Okay. I guess my last point I would maybe emphasize a bit is that bit in the middle where we talked about taking time to think about how your team works together in practice. I think that's quite a useful thing to do, because quite often when people have those experiences of we can never find shared files or we're spending ages looking through stuff, that's a kind of symptom of you've not taken the time to think about it as a team. And quite a good thing to do is think about somebody who's relatively new, and maybe as part of your induction process with them, say, has it been easy to find stuff, or do you have suggestions about where you'd like to see stuff? And that can be quite a good way of challenging your team and saying, let's be that little bit more organized so that we can share stuff more easily. Okay. Grand.
Brilliant.
Well, thanks very much indeed. I hope that was helpful. And as Jen said, we'll be sharing the slide deck afterwards, so you can access those links to our resources, the YouTube videos, and also connect about the Microsoft training if you wanted to do that.
Yep, brilliant. Thanks, John.
Great.
Just a couple of points from me as well was I mentioned at the top of the session that this is part of a series of workshops, and I've seen lots of new faces in this one actually, and we've got lots of friends from down south as well actually. So please do check out the upcoming sessions that we've got. There's a huge range of topics all around digital that we've been exploring throughout the session. I'm also in the process of uploading the recordings from all the previous sessions, so you'll have access to them as well. And the last wee bit from me is we're just asking if you can complete a really, really short feedback form, just giving us your thoughts around today's session. It'll take you seconds, but it would be really helpful if you could take the time to do that. But unless, John, you've got anything else, then that's it from me.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Have a great week, everyone.
Bye for now.